Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Happy Thanksgiving. My name is David Mirhady, and welcome on behalf of the Mirhady family, which I think may be better represented this evening than in years, especially because it's a holiday weekend. It's my job to ask you to turn off your cell phones and then to introduce you to Dean John Craig, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Simon Fraser, my boss, so to speak, to give you words of welcome from the university. John?
David, thanks very much. I think it's my job to remind you when your cell phones go off that you should turn them on at the end of the lecture. But no, that's just another way of reminding you. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Katharine Mirhady, members of the Mirhady family, Professor Janet Afary, on behalf of my colleagues in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this year's Doctors Fereidoun and Katharine Mirhady. Particular pleasure to welcome our distinguished visiting lecturer, Dr. Janet Afary, whose scholarship is such that it's claimed by two departments at the University of California, Santa Barbara, the Department of Religious Studies, where she's a professor, and the Department of Feminist Studies, where she holds the Mellichamp Chair in Global Religion and Modernity. The goal of the Mirhady Endowed Lecture, founded in January 2002, was to bring outstanding scholars of Iranian and Persian studies to Simon Fraser in order to make their work freely and publicly available to the citizens of Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. And in this, the lectures have been a tremendous success. It's wonderful to join you this evening on what is the 10th lecture in this series. But the vision of the Mirhadys was always wider than a successful public lecture series. It encompassed fostering and developing an understanding of Iranian history, culture, language, and literature. And to this end, we at Simon Fraser University are committed to the creation of a Center for Iranian Studies and Research. And I'm enormously grateful to my colleague, Professor Thomas Kuhn, in the Department of History, who's agreed to direct the fundraising for the center with the goals of offering quality instruction in Farsi at all levels, including the advanced, the teaching of Iranian material throughout the disciplines in our faculty, the provision of scholarships and residencies for academics, artists, poets, filmmakers, and musicians, the construction of a world-class Farsi library collection, and the sponsorship of international workshops and conferences. It's very difficult to compete with these images which are going up, which are fantastic. These are fantastic images, but I'm very, very pleased to report that we're already supporting the initiative to offer courses in both introductory and intermediate Farsi, modern Iranian history, and comparative Iranian literatures. And all these initiatives have proved instant hits, which means that they all fully enrolled, they're burst to the seams, and it's very clear to me that our students at Simon Fraser University are eager to learn about the history, language, and culture of Persia and Iran. And I'd be delighted, as I know that Thomas would, to speak with anyone here tonight, willing to assist us in realizing the vision of a world-class Iranian studies program at Simon Fraser University. But let me bring us back to the matter at hand, which is to hear Professor Afary, not me. And to that end, it's a very great pleasure to call upon my friend and colleague, Daryl McLean, one of the founders of our Middle East and Islamic program in the Department of History, and indeed the director of Simon Fraser's Center for the Comparative Study of Muslim Societies and Cultures, who's going to introduce this evening's distinguished speaker. Over to you, Daryl.
Thank you very much, John. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to add to John's comments the appreciation, my own personal appreciation, and the appreciation of the Mirhady Lecture Committee of the proposed SFU Center for Iranian Studies and Research. I think Vancouver deserves a world-class Iranian center that would be able to coordinate the research into the history and culture of Iran, and at the same time, one of the most important parts of it, at least for me, is the possibility of bringing major scholars, major artists, musicians, film directors, and the like, so that we can form a kind of, at SFU, a community of scholarship and a community of artistic expression. And I also think that this is not simply for Iranian Canadians, although of course it is for them, but I think Canadians more generally need to be reminded of the global importance of Persian literature, history, and culture. And I urge you all to look further into this center. It's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Janet Afary. Dr. Afary completed her master's degree in linguistics from Tehran University before moving to the University of Michigan, where she completed a PhD in history and Near East studies. Her doctoral dissertation immediately placed her in the first rank of Iranologists, meriting the Rackham Distinguished Dissertation Award and the Foundation for Iranian Studies Best Dissertation of the Year Award. Professor Afary commanded the attention of the Mirhady Lecture Committee this year for her 3 groundbreaking books on modern Iran: The Iranian Constitutional Revolution, Grassroots Democracy, Social Democracy, and the Origins of Feminism, published by Columbia University Press in 1996, Foucault and the Iranian Revolution, Genre and the Seductions of Islamism, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2005, and Sexual Politics in Modern Iran, published by Cambridge University Press just last year. All of Professor Afary's books are founded on the solid Farsi language archival basis expected of an historian, although not always delivered. They are expansive in the types of sources utilized for that history, and there are very few people who can move from 19th century Persian poetry through cartoons, photographs, women's magazines, and some of the images that you've seen in front of you already. They are multidimensional and interdisciplinary, drawing on history, sociology, anthropology, women's studies, and even world literature. And they are sensitive to nuance and change over time. You won't find any monotone in Professor Afary's work. But most importantly, at least to me as an historian, Dr. Afary's scholarship always manages to place Iranian history within larger schema for the understanding of gender formation within a critically informed social history. This is not at all easy to do, as generations of historians have discovered. Her most recent book, Sexual Politics in Modern Iran, infuses many of her perspectives on gender and history into a single narrative with a series of highly lucid, interrelated arguments and observations. These range from 19th century notions of concubinage through the growth of a Pahlavi authoritarian gender reforms to the unfinished sexual revolution of 21st century Iran. It is, in my view, one of the most significant and insightful works on Iranian gender and politics written in recent years, and I encourage you to read it. Please join me in welcoming Professor Afary.
Thanks so much. Appreciate the introduction. Thank you very, very much for that kind introduction, Dr. Katharine Mirhady and the Mirhady family for their very generous contribution to the Mirhady Lectureship. Dean John Gregg, very much for your presence, and Professor Daryl McLean and Professor Ellen Vaillancourt also for arranging the details of my trip, and also Mr. Ardalon Rizalmand, who very kindly has been accompanying me today. Let me end this PowerPoint. I just wanted you to get a little sense of 20th century Iran, since I'm not going to be able to cover everything in my lecture through these images. And so I'm going to close this and move to another very short PowerPoint, which will accompany my talk. I'm going to put this up there, so hopefully we'll see. Well, I guess the Chinese said, may you live in exciting times, as curse. And for many of us working on the Middle East, these are indeed very exciting times. And particularly this winter, and past winter has been an extraordinary time, a period we call the Arab Spring. The verdict is still out on the revolutions that are going on in Egypt, in Tunisia, now in Libya, who knows, maybe tomorrow in Syria. And we don't know whether these revolutions are going to be a continuation of the Islamist revolutions of the 70s. They certainly are not the continuation of the simple nationalist revolutions we had in the beginning of the 20th century. They may not be a continuation of the Islamist movements of the 70s, and in fact, they may be a third type of revolution, really, in the region, a sort of a post-Islamist revolution that nevertheless could very well be inspired by an Islamic revolution. How do we know where they may end up? We really don't. But it may be helpful to look at the Iranian example and the Iranian revolution and see if elements that made that revolution are also present in some of these modern revolutions going on before our eyes. And then I leave that judgment to you to see if, in fact, we're looking at a new phase or we're looking at a continuation of an old phase. Iranian society went through some dramatic changes in a very short time, in a period of about 70 years. When you look at Iranian history, and you look at it not in terms of just political history, constitutional revolution, the emergence of Reza Shah Pahlavi in the 20s and 30s, the period of Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, the nationalist who played such a formidable role in world politics in the 40s and 50s, the emergence of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who his own time was known as the modern Muslim leader, the man who was moving Iran, pushing Iran, galloping towards the, as he would call it, the gates of the 21st century. Or for that matter, the Islamic Revolution that happened in 1979. There's another way of looking at this history, and that is through the lens of gender and sexuality. In other words, what types of changes were going on in Iranian society in this brief period, really from about the late 19th century to the time of the 1979 revolution? Well, a great deal. When you look at the turn of the 20th century, most marriages were still happening almost entirely all marriages were happening as arranged marriages. That is, parents would arrange the marriage of a young girl and a young boy. Sometimes very soon after they were born, sometimes when they were 8 or 9, there would be an agreement between the two families, and then the young girl would move to her husband's house, depending on her age, more or less around 12 in the big cities, and she would have multiple children, marriage was universal. Everyone got marriage, even if you were disabled. Somehow, somewhere, there would be a wife for you or a husband for you. Illiteracy, of course, was common. Very, very small percentage of society was literate. Infant mortality was incredibly high. 70% of children died between the ages of 1 and 5. In this society, marriage was not a companionate institution. Marriage was essentially an institution for procreation, as it had been in most of the world until essentially the advent of modernity in European and American society. Love was not necessarily found in marriage. People loved, and of course they have always loved, but that didn't mean that love was in marriage, and it didn't mean that love was heterosexual as we define it today. There were all sorts of relationships that took place before marriage, in the course of a marriage, after marriage, including same-sex relationships, and these were acceptable forms of relationship. Marriages were not monogamous, although they were for the vast majority of the country, but for the elite, for the people who moved up, marriage was polygamous. So once you actually made money and moved to a second social class, upper social class, you took a second wife if you were an urban or a person, or even if you were head of a tribe, for example. Marriage then therefore goes through an enormous change in the institution of sexuality between 1905-06, the time of the Iranian constitutional revolution, and the time of the revolution. There's different waves of change. There's the first wave is educational reforms of the constitutional revolution. Women have to be educated. The constitutionalists say they should have the right to form their own organizations. They should have their own philanthropic societies. By the 30s, it's women should become involved in sports and partake of that. They should appear more and more in public spaces. They should be able to go to the university. By the 40s, large number of urban women are working. Paid employment, therefore. Question of suffrage is discussed and debated. Iranians are actively fighting for women's suffrage, urban Iranians, in the late 1940s, the time of period of Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. In the 1950s and 60s, there's the question of reform in marriage and reform in the institution of divorce also. And these become very volatile issues at the time. Why are they so important? Because in a way, there had been an agreement between Iranian intellectuals of the early 20th century and the Iranian public. The agreement went along something like this. Allow us to educate the women of this country. We need to become a modern nation, a strong nation. We need to become independent of Western and imperial powers. But to do that, we need to have educated women who are better mothers, who can train and raise a new generation of children. And to accomplish that goal, therefore, please allow us to educate your daughters, to send them to the workplace, to send them to the university. And in return, we make a promise. We promise you that women will remain loyal daughters. They will remain dutiful wives and mothers, and that they would not really change in this area. We promise you that. We promise you that we will not change the Sharia law insofar as women and gender is concerned. We have to change other laws in relating to commerce and industry, but we will respect the Sharia law insofar as family, as marriage is concerned. And this social contract had essentially held its own so that parents had, to a greater extent in urban communities, encouraged their daughters to go to school, finish high school. Many started to go also to the university by the 1960s and 1970s. And then something happened, and that thing was the sexual revolution of the West, which dramatically transformed the situation in Iran. So just before I get to that point, let me tell you a little bit about what happened in the 50s. After the overthrow of the government of Mossadegh, the Shah of Iran returned. He embarked on a massive program of economic development and modernization. He was aided by the United States government. He was able to use increased proceeds from Iran's oil industry. And then he went about eliminating his political opponents. The Communist Party, Tudeh Party, eliminated all members of that, particularly those who had been involved in the army. And he also formed the SAVAK, the secret police organization, with the help of the CIA and the Mossad. In order to show his gratitude to the clerics for having supported him against Mossadegh, he also campaigned against the Baha'is, the bête noire of the religious right, and he lifted some of the religious restrictions that his father had imposed on society. He then went on to declare his white revolution in the 1960s, early 1960s period. The White Revolution was also influenced by the fact that things had changed in America. The election of John Kennedy signaled a change in US policy, and the Kennedy administration wanted to see less authoritarian rulers in the Middle East region as a way of essentially confronting the Soviet influence, obviously, in the region, and the growth of the left in the region. And the White Revolution became the Shah's constitution. That's what his prime minister would dub it. It had several components to it. It had land reform, and it had granting, selling government lands to finance land reform, had profit sharing for workers, for example, nationalization of forests and pastures, health corps, reconstruction, and so forth. But insofar as our discussion is concerned, one of the most important components of it was the right to vote for women, so women's suffrage. Now, symbolically, this was a very important right. It was not an important right in actuality, because in reality, the vote didn't mean anything in Iran at that time. Parliament was, members of parliament were essentially handpicked by the government, and then they went through these sham elections. But symbolically, it was a very important right. And it was at this point that we begin to see the clerics distancing themselves from the government of Ayatollah Khomeini, the same clerics who had supported him through Mossadegh period, the same clerics who had been very happy that the Shah had allowed them essentially to destroy Baha'i centers in Iran, were not furious with him over the White Revolution. They were angry because they were worried that the land reform might actually extend to the Waqf land endowments that were held by the clerics, but they were also very angry about the right to vote for women, and more importantly, the right of women to be elected. There's a distinction here. Some clerics, including even Khomeini at the time, agreed with the idea of women voting, but not with the idea of women being elected to positions of power. And so this is essentially a very important breach that happens between the Shah, who's now trying to distance himself from the landed aristocracy, from the clerics, from the bazaris, and align himself more with the more modern sector, the modern middle classes of society. The problem is that he's not willing to grant them enough democratic rights. And so essentially we'll see he unmoors himself. He has no anchor. He loses his touch with the clerical establishment, the bazaris, without really establishing himself firmly as a protector of the more modern middle classes. The land reform has another implication in that Iranian society in the 1960s, urban population of Iran was probably a third, but by 1977, 78, half of Iran is urbanized. And that's because many of these peasants, for a variety of reasons, sell the land that's given to them and now en masse start moving to the cities. As these, so here's the situation now. The Shah is continuing his clamping down on sort of democratic reforms, allowing women's rights nevertheless to grow. And peasants are flowing into the city and being bombarded by the new culture of the city that's entirely alien to them in terms of the culture in which they had grown. So the Shah supports the formation of the Women's Organization of Iran. It's a picture of Mahnaz Afkhami, director of the Women's Organization of Iran. The organization forms 400 branches in Iran. It's a huge organization. Starts with providing women with employment opportunity, employment instruction, realizes that if women are going to go to these classes, they need childcare. Starts therefore providing childcare for women. After childcare, realizes that, well, young people need health for themselves, for their families, so provides clinics, health clinics for taking care of mothers and daughters and sons. And then after that, as women become more aware of their rights, they start essentially demanding more rights. So issues of divorce, for example, comes up, and it starts educating women about their rights. And so the organization, as Mahnaz Afkhami recalls in her memoirs, and I've interviewed her also on this, although it's very much associated with the Shah, with the Pahlavi regime, it's actually not so much a top-down organization as the records of the time suggested. It actually is an organization that's very, very influential in terms of the work that it's doing with ordinary people. And yet the leaders of the organization feel that they should give all credit to everything that they're doing to the Pahlavi family. That's because every time they introduce a new initiative, they're faced with clerical opposition and conservative opposition. And the only way they know how to go about that opposition is to say, well, you know, the Shah ordered that we do this, or the Queen ordered that we do this, or the Shah's sister suggested that we do this. And of course, then all impediments are removed. And in this way, they start tackling some very, very critical issues. So, for example, they start addressing sexist portrayal of women in textbooks. They changed textbooks in elementary school and high school and try to present a more positive image of women. They start to distribute birth control methods, various forms of birth control. They even make abortion permissible by simply issuing a decree that goes to all doctors' offices saying that abortion up to 3 months should be allowed. And so the doctors actually perform that when a woman shows up in their offices. And yet the organization becomes daily more and more distant from the vast majority of Iranian women who see it as simply an organization set up by a highly dictatorial Shah, a Shah that has put in place a savak that's infiltrating every classroom. I was in school at this time, and I remember our professors trembling if you asked them a question, because you never knew who was sitting in the back of a class taking note, whether it was a savak agent or not. It really was, and we had to be very careful. I remember we didn't have a copy machine because you weren't allowed to copy anything, and if you wanted to copy anything, small student brochure or something, you had to go all the way to the top level of the university to be able to get permission for something like that. So in this type of an environment where trade unions weren't allowed, for example, to function, student organizations weren't allowed to function, the national organization, this international organization for women, was openly functioning with 400 branches all over the country. So you can imagine the kind of anger and resentment that the vast majority of people felt towards the organization, even though it was doing a great deal of actually good. Now, as these changes were happening in Iranian society, urban marriages were getting more companionate. Polygamy was becoming far less prevalent in society. It was really looked down upon. The institution of temporary marriage, which is a kind of union between a man and woman, essentially for sexual pleasure, was almost disappearing, except around shrines, as it's something actually similar to brothels, for example, around Catholic shrines in Europe. It's something, you have to think of it as something along those lines. So that was also changing. The old practice of what we call status-defined homosexuality, the man-boy concubine relationship, that was disappearing. I have an interesting story to tell you. It's actually from my father, who used to run a factory in Iran. And he told me a story about how when he opened this factory, they hired a large number of shoemakers from a province to come and work there. And these shoemakers all came and brought with them 2 or 3 apprentices. And one day there was a big fight and ruckus, and they inquired about it, and they found out that the fight was over a 14-year-old boy. And they brought him in and said, "What's going on?" And it turned out that the boy had 2 lovers, male lovers, and they both wanted him, and there was a fight over him. So they intervene and say, "Well, who's harassing you?" And the boy says, No, this is not harassment. I'm involved. This is okay. It's okay with me. I'm a willing participant in this." So the factory owners kind of, scratched their head and don't know quite what to do with this situation, because they had allowed this group of shoemakers to sleep in the factory overnight because they had nowhere else to go because they had come from the provinces. And eventually they decided this just can't go on. So they call them in and they say, look, we can't allow you to stay in the factory with your mentee, and we suggest you go and get yourself a separate dwelling. And of course, the shoemakers get incredibly angry. En masse, they leave the factory. And that's how women, by the way, are hired in the factory for the first time. An interesting story with all sorts of implications. But what it suggests is that these sort of old practices were dying out and becoming unacceptable in urban Iranian society. And so all this is going on. What's happening in the rural areas of Iran? Not very much. Illiteracy is still very common. Marriages are still arranged. Marriages are still arranged at a very young age. Although the legal age of marriage for girls is now 18, most parents arrange a temporary marriage between the young people when they're very young, and then when they get older and with several children, they go and turn it into a formal marriage. But they're nevertheless exposed to the city life. They're coming to the city and they're watching James Bond movies and seeing the car posters, and with bikini-clad girls spread on top of these big Oldsmobiles, and they buy these posters and bring them back to the village and show it off in the village. So the village life is not immune from what is happening. And as I mentioned to you, there are these millions of peasants who are now moving to the cities in search of job, and they're becoming exposed to city life. And Iranian society, where do they find an organization, an institution where they feel more at home? Well, it's only the mosque. There's nothing else available for them, really. So the mosques become a center for these immigrant workers, peasants now turned industrial workers or construction workers. And this is also a time when the Shah of Iran, who's so frightened with the left, nevertheless allows these mosques to proliferate, because they may be dangerous, but no one anticipated at the time a revolution, an Islamist revolution. Everyone thought it would be another left revolution, another Bolshevik revolution, another, at best, social democratic revolution. And so mosques are proliferating in the cities, and they're absorbing this immigrant worker community. As the sexual mores of the city is dramatically shifting. I showed you some of the cartoons of the period. What do those cartoons tell us? These are all urban women, police officers, nurses, secretaries, and they're regarded as sex objects in the workplace. And by the way, these were Playboy was doing the same thing. A lot of Japanese cartoons were doing the same thing. This is a period thing. Women are entering the workforce, but they're really a sexual play thing for the men. And of course, there would be a lot of talk about that. If you got a job, if you were a nurse and you were a single woman, well, there was a lot of talk. When you left your home and you went to the hospital and you came back, there were 60 pairs of eyes looking at you, watching every move you had. What time did you come home? What time did you leave? Did anyone come with you? Was anyone accompanying you? Questions like that. But nevertheless, mores of society is shifting, and one of the best examples of that there are two good examples to give. One is the memoirs of a cabaret singer, essentially a former prostitute who's a cabaret singer called Mahvash, which becomes a bestseller and goes through numerous printing. And this memoir is talking about essentially women's sexuality. And he's talking about women's sexual desires and women's sexual needs, and how there has to be foreplay, and how there has to be some understanding of these issues in Iranian society. So that's at the level of the very common person really reading this in the cities. And at the level of high society, there is Furuq Farrokhzad. And I forgot to show you my cartoons here. So this is a family protection court. This is the courts that were set up by the Organization of Women, Iranian Women's Organization, where women had a right now to ask for divorce under certain conditions. And one of them was that if your husband was taking a second wife, you now had a right to ask for a divorce. And became very, very popular, these courts at the time. And these are some of the cartoons that I was showing you. And of course, the one on the left it's a bride and groom. The idea is that, you know, you're supposed to get married one time, and this woman has been married multiple times, and every time she goes to the same hotel, and every time the bed breaks. I mean, can you imagine a woman getting married multiple times? That's what the idea, and having so much sexual experience, essentially. And the other one is there were hundreds of these cartoons that from the period, Sex in the Office. And this is Forough Farrokhzad. I was talking about high society and the poetry, and this is a sort of a first feminist poet of the period, the 1960s. Young woman, brilliant, becomes a filmmaker, produces several collection of poems. Her own life is also dramatic. She marries essentially for love, despite her parents' objection. Then the marriage doesn't work out. She has a son. She gets a divorce, which is a scandal because she falls in love with another man. Even bigger scandal, and she leaves. Essentially, she gives up the custody of her son. Huge, huge pain throughout her whole life. And then she writes these poems, which people assume to be autobiographical, and I'm going to read just one line of it. I sinned the sin that pleased me utterly in arms that trembled with ecstasy. And you can imagine, Qom just practically burst when this was published, the idea that a woman would sin and then she would actually write about it. All right, so as this was going in the cities, what was actually happening in terms of people who were dissidents, who opposed the regime? Well, there were really three types of reaction, if I could summarize them. First was the reaction of the young college-age people, many of them first generation in their families to go to college. These are young people who joined organizations like the Fereidoun Khalq and Mujahideen Khalq. Mujahideen Khalq, who are more numerous, members of this organization often belonged to the old middle classes. Their fathers were members of the Bazaar. These were young people, girls who, first time in their life, in their family, in their history, had gone to college. And so negotiating this relationship between home and city and village and college was hugely, hugely difficult. The city life was entirely different. So how did you remain the good, modest girl that your parents demanded of you, and yet embrace this life on college campus where everyone was reading Sartre and Kafka and Marx, and modernist art was the big discussion, and films were coming in, and Fellini, and all that was going on in the city. What were you supposed? Where was your place? And a lot of people joined these underground leftist organizations they started reading the Marxist literature, and they adopted a very, very, very simple attire. They gave up lipstick and perfume, no small jewelry, nothing. I mean, t-shirt and pants, and usually a scarf, very, very modest look, very serious look. And they were going to change Iranian society, but not for these, what they call frivolous urban women involved in discussions of sex, but for the real woman, the working, the peasant, the industrial worker. They were going to create employment and jobs and daycares maybe for them and food for them. It was as if sex wasn't a part of a life of a peasant and farmer woman. Kind of the notion of a peasant or worker was a sort of an asexual being who really was just concerned with food and the very basics of life. And they were influenced by intellectuals like Ali Shariati and Jalal al-Ahmad, intellectuals who had been Marxists at one point in their lives. But then after the coup, CIA coup in Iran, had a complete breakdown, essentially, because they no longer regarded the West as a model. The West had betrayed them. The West, which was a champion of democracy, had carried out a coup in their country, in a country that was going to be a democratic society. So they weren't going to trust the West anymore. They certainly didn't trust the East, the Soviet Union. And they thought that they were going to present a third alternative form, essentially, of existence, a kind of existence, native existence, that got everything that was the best in Western society. So its technology and its industry and its educational institutions and certainly gave up everything that was bad, and that was the sexual revolution that was happening in the West. That was the gay rights movement that was happening in the West. They said, we don't have these things in our country. We don't have gays. We've given up on all those things. But the Europeans tell us that, well, this way of life has always existed, and so we therefore must accept it. And we do not accept this kind of argument. That's what they would say. And so that's kind of one generation that is looking at these Islamist thinkers. This new generation of Islamist thinkers who are becoming influential, they're impacting the Mujahideen Khalq. Another example of that I can give you is the life of, for example, Zahra Rahnavard. Zahra Rahnavard came from a very traditional family, very religious family. When she goes to college, and she talks about very difficult, she says, modernity and Marxism were like, a scissor just cutting into the fabric of everything I believed in. No longer I knew what was right and what was wrong. I had no idea in this world what was correct and what was incorrect. Everything that I had believed in had been undermined, and new values had been replaced by it, and I no longer could make sense of this world. She becomes a follower of Ali Shariati, who's suggesting that women adopt this new way of dressing called the hijab. The thing that we call the hijab today is really a modern invention, the idea of a long scarf and not wearing short sleeve but long sleeve, and long pants and long skirt. Adopting that kind of way of life, ascetic life, a life that doesn't involve any kind of sex with men or interaction really with men, other than being in a political organization with them talking about the socialist revolution or the future society, which was going to solve all these problems of society. And she essentially has I would call a kind of in Eric Fromm's word, a kind of an escape from freedom. She goes to Tehran University, she's an art student, and she almost has a breakdown. She cannot relate to these norms and values of Tehran University and its art department and art values in general. And so she joins the circle of Ali Shariati. She becomes this modest woman, but she doesn't change in every aspect of her life. And this is the point that I'm trying to make, is that these dissidents who in some form or other join Islamist organizations are not making a complete break with modernity, but they're making compromises with modernity. So for example, Zahra Rahnavard gets married, has 2 children. Her mother is taking care of her children. She's writing, she's doing poetry, she's creating art, she's creating statues. I mean, it's a very, very busy woman. And in that way, very, very modern. But then, of course, the values that she talks about is that women should be modest and should be good wives and good mothers and good daughters and also good members of society, active members of society. She leaves Iran, comes to the United States, joins the Confederation of Iranian Students. When the Confederation breaks, she joins the Islamist wing of it. After the revolution, she goes back to Iran, and her husband is a very close associate of Khomeini, and she becomes head of a number of very important and influential women's organizations. In the early years of the revolution, she was a real strong supporter of the Islamist revolution. She would, for example, I remember she went to India, and she would talk about dowry burnings in India, and she would say, well, you all have to become Muslim, and then the problem is solved, because in Islam we have none of these problems. So no sensitivity, for example, about minorities in Iran or Baha'is, or about the persecution that happened after the revolution at urban women, none whatsoever. She was a straight and strong supporter of the Islamist movement. Later on, of course, those of you who follow the news, she becomes one of the leaders of the Green Movement 2 years ago with her husband. There's another kind of compromise with modernity. Another kind of compromise with modernity are women, and I call these probably an escape from tradition. So if the first generation are college students who are joining underground organizations like the Fereidoun and the Mujahideen, The second example are people like Zahra Rahnavard, who joined the circle of Ali Shariati, break essentially with that kind of modern lifestyle, and nevertheless remain very modern in their life. The third example is Marzieh Dabagh. She gets married at the age of 12 or 13, arranged marriage, very little education, in a small town, highly religious father. She and her husband moved to the big city, and she has a breakdown at this point. She defines it, you can read it, hysterically crying, not being able to work for months on, staying in bed. What are the issues? Why has Quran said that women should not be educated? Who says that the Quran said women should not be educated, she says. Who says that women should not be working? In other words, why are these urban women doing these things and I'm not allowed to do it? And so finally her husband says, you have so many questions, I can't answer them. Why don't you go to the mosque and start studying the Quran, and maybe you'll find the answers. And so she goes to her local mosque, and it happens to be a local mosque that very actively is propagating Ayatollah Khomeini's ideas. By this point, Ayatollah Khomeini is in exile and is becoming a very active opponent of the Shah of Iran. So she goes into the mosque, Marzieh Dabagh, and she starts studying the Quran, and she starts studying the Sharia, and she becomes excellent at this, excellent. And they decide to recruit her for other work, essentially political work. And by this stage, she has 6 or 7 children, you realize. She's married, and meanwhile, she's being groomed. Okay, for this next stage, they say, you have to look like a more modern woman, because we're going to send you to different cities to lecture about Islam and essentially Islamism, and how a new Islamist society would solve all the problems of contemporary society. So she wears a modern dress, she starts driving a car, she leaves her family with her older daughter and her mother, and she starts traveling. So all the things that Ayatollah Khomeini said women aren't supposed to do, mingling with unrelated men, driving, wearing modern dresses. She does all that, and that's okay. Ayatollah Khomeini himself says that's okay in her case, because she's doing valuable work for the movement. She's arrested, she's tortured by the Savak, she's almost dying. The Savak decides to release her because she is a mother with several children. What would it mean to have a woman like that die in prison? And she goes abroad, then she goes to Syria, and then in Syria, with the help of the Secret Amal organization, the Lebanese organization, she starts training guerrillas, who then she sends back to Iran. This is someone who then becomes a bodyguard of Ayatollah Khomeini. This is someone who, after the revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini sends to Moscow to negotiate with Mikhail Gorbachev. Later on, he becomes Iran's member of parliament of Iran for 4 terms. So women respond in very different ways. While the upper echelons of Iranian society is identifying itself with the Organization of Iranian Women and its branches, significant number of women are choosing other directions. Some joining the leftist organizations, Mujahideen, Khalq, and Fereidoun. Many becoming supporters of Shariati and thinking that what he's suggesting is really an alternative way, a third way for them, a way away from Western modernity and a way away from Soviet style of essentially modernity. And even some, like Marzieh Dabagh, highly traditional women, and I collected about 100 biographies of these women who joined the organization of Ayatollah Khomeini himself. And they're very similar biographies. They're women with very little education, women at the margins of society, women who use the new political Islam to essentially emancipate themselves from these highly, highly traditional families. And this continues after the revolution also. And let me say just one word about that, and then I want to just read you a little thing about how Ayatollah Khomeini finally manages to bring all these different sectors of society together. After the revolution, large numbers of women are recruited into the Islamist movement at the political organization or on the war front later on during the war between Iran and Iraq as nurses and aides and so forth. And this also proves to be an emancipatory opportunity for them because they can leave their highly traditional families who say that they should get married at the age of 13 and 14. They go to the war front, and then they become essentially a beneficiary of war subsidies after the war, which means that up to the age of 25, they can go to school, all tuition paid, all expenses paid. And many of them then find themselves in a position where not only are they getting a university degree, but their families are encouraging them to get a PhD because, of course, everything is paid for. And you have all these benefits that you can take advantage of. So the same government who, after the revolution, clamps down on urban women's rights, destroys and guts the family protection law, which had given women the right to divorce, reintroduces polygamy, brings back the idea of temporary marriage, lowers the age of marriage to 9 for girls, actually. The same government who is doing this, within this government, women who joined the Islamist organizations managed to carve in their own lives a great degree of freedom. And that's the really big contradiction of these Islamist movements. The same phenomenon has been happening in many other parts of the region, and not just, by the way, in Islamist movement, but in the religious right organizations everywhere in the United States. Among the religious right organizations, Hindu religious right organizations, Christian religious rights organizations, and even some Jewish religious right organizations. Women who join these organizations and become leaders of these movements happen to not have to really take care of the family anymore and cook every day and clean every day. Somehow the mother, the sister, it's okay for them, even the husband, to take care of the children. They travel quite a bit, they publish, they write, they produce art, they write poetry, they proselytize, they live an independent lives for themselves as they're telling other women to be good and devoted wives and mothers and daughters and sacrifice themselves for the cause of the Islamist movements. Just to read, I want to read you just one little thing from my book, and then I'll be happy to take questions, okay? So then is this kind of anger and anxiety that exists in Iranian society aimed at urban women, and I think those cartoons really show it. Anger at all levels of society towards urban women who are seen as highly sexualized, who are seen as breaking down with mores of society. And what these women had done was that simply they had broken one major tradition of not just Muslim, but Middle Eastern societies, and that is that a girl from the ages of 12, 13, menarche essentially, to menopause should be under the protection of a man. She should have a husband, or there should be a brother. If she gets a divorce, she should be absorbed into the extended family. She should become a second wife of somebody. That's what happened to women. It's not like there wasn't any divorces going on. There were divorces, and men, of course, passed away, husbands passed away, but these women were always as absorbed into the extended family. As they would be the nannies to the children. They would be the second and third wife to a richer man. That's the kind of work that they did. They would be a temporary marriage wife and eventually a prostitute. What was this generation doing that was so outrageous was that they were carving out an independent life for themselves, was that they no longer, first of all, they no longer agreed that the father would choose their partner for them. They chose their own partner. And secondly, if the marriage didn't work out, they moved out, they got an apartment, they got a job. That's what they were doing. That was the big taboo that they had broken. And that was a big taboo, by the way, in all of the religions of the Middle East at the time. Jewish, Christian, Baha'i, Muslim, Shi'i, Sunni, didn't make any difference. That was a big taboo, not being under the protection of the man. And there was all this talk about women on drove are divorcing their husbands and leaving. I looked at the statistics. In fact, the opposite had happened. Divorce rates had actually halved when men lost the right to divorce their wives at will, and women got the right to divorce if the man took a second wife. the rates of divorce actually became half of what they were before. But there was this perception that women are just let loose and that they're going about their sexual desire, and that society was no longer going to tolerate that. And that became really anti-imperialism. The coup that had displaced Mossadegh was one big factor that brought about a coalition. And the opposition to the freedoms of the new urban woman, urban educated woman, these were the two elements that really cemented the revolution and turned it into this revolution in the way that it appeared. And just let me finish with this. For nearly a century, Iranian intellectuals had looked to the West as a possible model for gender reforms in Iran. They had supported calls for women's education and employment and assumed that these changes produced better mothers and wives, strengthened the family and the nation. But by the 1970s, they no longer accepted the Western sexual revolution that was gradually spreading to Iran. Soon there was an ideological split between those who advocated women's emancipation and those who supported a radical socialist and/or Islamic revolution. Secondly, the antagonism toward the new gender constructs of the 1970s and 60s also appeared among women themselves. Even those who had benefited from the regime's gender reforms felt ambivalent about the rapid pace of change and the new dictates of modernity. Many found the aesthetics of Western feminine body repugnant and impossible to achieve. Now, Western feminists, too, had written that the bodily norms set by the fashion industry and Hollywood created impossible ideals for women. But this point did not penetrate into the Iranian debate of the time. Also, the near total identification of Iranian feminism with the Pahlavi society, with the Pahlavi regime, over the past half century had created a cultural rupture in Iranian society. As a result, the Islamist movement found it easy to gain the support of large contingents of women, including some branches of the government-backed Women's Organization of Women, Iran. Third, Khomeini, unlike his ideological predecessors, other clerics in Iran's history, did not completely turn his back on modernity. In the 40s, he appropriated some modern norms of hygiene and the requirements of a modern state. Later, he accepted the select gender reforms, such as women's suffrage, education, and active political participation. As the story of Marzieh Dabbagh shows, even before the revolution, the pragmatic Khomeini was willing to bend rules and allow his disciples to adopt a modern lifestyle in order to promote the cause. He also freely borrowed Sexuality and third worldism, frequently using terms such as colonialism, imperialism, exploitation, social revolution, thereby creating a new anti-imperialist Islamist discourse. Fourth, the writings of Sexuality, which amalgamated Marxism and Islamism, and the lectures of Khomeini, which advocated the politicized anti-imperialist concept of Islam, were not so far from expressing the beliefs of many on the left who saw imperialism as the primary enemy and feminism as a Western import and therefore decadent. Some sectors of the left briefly defended women's rights after the Islamist seizure of power, but others shared the Islamist view that those who demonstrated against Khomeini's rollback of women's rights were either naive or outright tools of the imperialist powers, which wished to divide the revolutionaries in order to intervene in Iran, as they had done in 1953. Thus, these three oppositional currents, secular leftists, supporters of Sexuality, and followers of Khomeini, agreed that the preservation of the nation's independence and cultural identity depended on maintaining many existing gender norms, even though they differed in their articulation of what constituted this ostensibly authentic cultural realm. Through a masterful synthesis of Shi'i religious traditions and leftist anti-imperialist discourses, Khomeini tapped into the discontent with modernity and its technologies of the body and succeeded in setting the ideological, organizational, and political agenda for the revolution. The initial result was a retrogressive religious dictatorship. It began by attacking the personal rights of modern urban women and went on to destroy all democratic and secular opposition, whether on the left or among rival, less authoritarian currents of political Islam. The regime became a rallying point for a militant Islamism throughout the Muslim world, in Algeria, Egypt, Lebanon, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and even Saudi Arabia, transcending at times the sectarian divisions between Shias and Sunnis. And so to come back to the question that I posed at the very beginning about the future of the Arab awakening in the region, to me, a great deal of it depends on these societies' attitude about gender. Tunisia has a much better history of gender reform. It has certainly been very successful ever since the revolution in 1956 and Bourguiba coming to power in systematically and methodically introducing greater women's rights. Egypt is a more complicated case where the Muslim Brotherhood has done many of the things that happened in Iran, the early Muslim Brotherhood. But today we know that there are divisions within Muslim Brotherhood, and some of it is about the Sharia and interpretation of Sharia over gender reforms. So the Muslim Brotherhood of today isn't the Muslim Brotherhood of the 1970s and 1980s. Libya, again, very complicated. Gaddafi has been totally identified with women's progress and women in uniform, a little bit like the way the Shah of Iran was in terms of the champion of modernity. Is there going to be a backlash now that Gaddafi is overthrown? To what extent Libyan women can actually maintain some of the rights they gained under his highly authoritarian rule? Remains to be seen, but I would suggest you look at gender issues as a key. Thank you.
Hi, and thank you for your wonderful presentation of all the information in your speech. My question is about you divided the groups in three groups: the lefties, those who were the follower of the Shariati, and those who were the follower of the Khomeini. Lefties, as you know, are a very minority in Iran, in whole, and among women, of course, again, a minority. Why do you think that, the central fold of the core of these division are Islam? Even Shariati is a kind of Islam, but kind of a reform Islam. Why do you think that is this? Still, even though they were embracing the modern society, still they were trying to include Islam in their ideology.
I honestly don't think it's Islam. I think it's patriarchy, but it's more convenient to say it's Islam. Because when you look at what people want to keep, what aspects of the Sharia are they fighting so hard to keep? You look at, for example, these books called Explanation of Problems that the clerics have written through 2 centuries. And you see they keep revising it and changing and dropping parts of it. They don't have any problem with industrialization. They don't have any problem with cars, for example, trucks, roads, scientific discoveries. They want to bracket out a part of the Sharia that relates to family and gender. That's really the key part. It's also about keeping social hierarchies of more traditional society. That could be, in fact, in itself be a whole lecture about what we mean by Islam is really a way of maintaining social hierarchies. Let me give you just one example of that, the notion of justice. The notion of justice, pre-modern concept of justice, didn't mean what we mean today by justice. Justice meant that everybody should be treated according to their station in life. So if a landlord killed a peasant, the landlord wasn't executed for killing a peasant because the landlord was a landlord and the peasant was a peasant. He might be, slapped a little bit or talked to, but they certainly wouldn't be punished any more than that. Men had a different station than women. Our modern concept of justice, at least what we aspire to, not what we have achieved, is that people should be treated equally before the law. And so one of the aspects of modern justice is that we say men and women should be treated for the same, for example, crime. Men and women should have the same rights. And this is simply unacceptable to many people from traditional sectors of society. And it's not just the men, by the way. It's also for the women when they become mother-in-laws. Because they want one thing for their daughters and one thing for their daughter-in-law, right? They want their daughters to be educated, but most of the time they don't really want their daughter-in-law to go and work and be employed. They want her to stay home and take care of the children. So women buy into what we call the patriarchal system and become part of that, and they get rewarded by enforcing patriarchal values. And women play a huge part in enforcing patriarchal values as they get older. So I think when you look at these religious right movements, whether the Christian or the Islamist one or the Hindu one, you see this core. Again and again, we're coming back to old traditional notions of justice and not modern ones.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your knowledge. I wanted to ask you about the other ethnic groups who live in Iran, like the Jewish women or other ethnic groups. How were they reacting to what was happening in Iran? And the second question is, during the 70s and 80s, one of the women's slogans was, "We have no country." They were operating as if like a global citizen, helping each other out in terms of solidarity. Was there any solidarity among the Iranian women towards other women in terms of global liberation of women?
When one result of the Islamist revolution was that a lot of ethnic minorities left the country, religious minorities left the country. So Iran actually has a very small population of religious minorities. The Baha'is remain the most persecuted minority of Iran to this day, and to this day, many have remained there. But the Jews and the Armenians and many of the Zoroastrians and also many of the Baha'is have actually left and moved to, well, Canada and the United States and elsewhere. In terms of, let me just use your question to say that a lot of things have changed in Iran. What happened was that, so that was the first generation that made the revolution. By the second and third generation, today we have a third generation in Iran. And these are children of the revolution. These are people who don't remember the pre-revolutionary period. Many of them come from, well, the ones who actually have wealth and are in positions of power come from Islamist families. And so these young women who are educated now, as you know, there's a huge percentage of, I mean, something like a couple years ago, 65% almost of entering classes at universities became women, so that they had to establish a quota for men, as they do everywhere in the world, by the way, these days. And so women are becoming highly educated, and another thing that the Islamic Republic did was that it instituted a very successful family planning program, and I talk about that in the book. They did so because population was astronomical, it was completely out of control. After they took away birth control and abortion, population jumped up, and then they reinstituted family planning. And they did it actually in a very, very smart way with the help of doctors who had stayed in Iran and had been active in the Pahlavi period and the family protection policies. And they were now able to carry out these policies with government backing. So, for example, contraceptive became free or almost totally available. They opened up clinics where you can take your children for vaccination, but you can also get birth control pills there. Vasectomy and sterilization are not only cheap or, free, but that there are clinics, mobile clinics that go to villages, and you can go to these clinics and carry this out. IUD is available. So they were able to bring down the population to actually it's under 2 right now in Iran. And so one ramification of that is that the new generation is more educated, it's practicing birth control, families are smaller, and people are living longer. And so the same thing that happened in this country is happening there, which is that as people live longer, as marriages becomes not just an institution for procreation, the question of companionship in marriage becomes more important, the question of love becomes more important, the question of good sex becomes more important. And this is what's happening in Iranian society today, as sex is becoming more important. A lot of these classes that the government has started for birth control, they started not with birth control, but they started by giving sex education to young people. And part of that sex education was to talk about sexual desire in both men and women. And that was sometimes the first place village girls learned about sex and about orgasm. So all of this has had a huge impact in society in that the new generation is not at all, the grandmothers and mothers' generation. It's a generation with very new demands. And so the old gulf that existed between urban women and rural women, between women from the conservative middle classes and the more modern classes, between the East and the West, that just doesn't exist anymore, certainly not to the extent that it existed before. Today, Iranian women, and of course through social media, are much more in tune with what's going on around the world, and feel an affinity, both men and women, in terms of what they see, as Egyptian young people are doing, as the Tunisians are doing, as the Moroccans are doing. We've become actually quite closer and more aware of each other. Let me give you another statistic on that, which is that even in Afghanistan, where there's something like 200 publications with 5,000 readers, each issuing like 5,000 issues, which is a very, very low number. I mean, these were numbers we had in the Middle East at the beginning of the 20th century. So in terms of books, non-existent, TV programs, very little. And yet 16 million out of 30 have mobile phones, and many have smartphones. And so the people are connected to the rest of the world through internet and are going through a dramatic change. And so I would say that there's actually a greater affinity, solidarity, if you call global feminism. But the issues are, you see, different. I mean, Iranian women are fighting for one thing right now, and American women might be fighting for something else, and Canadian women might be fighting for something similar to what American women are fighting for. But I think they're all connected, interconnected, and people no longer see these issues as, we have nothing, the West has nothing to offer us, and we have our own culture, and we're completely separate from them. I think there's much more of a dialogue now going on.
I want to thank you for coming today. It's a pleasure. I just want to know, for you, how do you think acculturation has influenced Iranian immigrant women's sexuality in the West? And do you think it has an influence back in Iran for the women?
I'm just involved in a study with a sociologist friend, Roger Freeland, at Santa Barbara to study precisely that question. So if you ask me in about a year, I can give you a better answer. However, now we just created a survey to study sexual practices among immigrant and also people from the Middle Eastern communities. And so if you want to friend me, I'll be happy to put you in touch, and please distribute the survey among your friends, and then in a year I'll be happy to give you the results.
I've started actually a little bit of a research here. So,
great, wonderful.
Yeah, I hope to one day work together and share.
I'd be delighted. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Professor Afary. It was a great pleasure to hear my country's history from women's perspective.
Thank you.
As you know, 1 Million Signatures campaign is a grassroots movement. It's peaceful, and it works for women's rights in Iran since 2005. In some of the literatures that has been produced by the scholars working in 1 Million Signatures campaign, they consider a clear demarcation between state-sponsored feminism and grassroots feminism in Iran. Both examples that we had in this talk, if we consider that category, would be placed in the state-sponsored feminism. How do you feel about this demarcation? Should we take it seriously? How do you see the role of state in pursuing women's rights and help us to progress? Or we should consider grassroots movements as the only way that we can
I don't. So, for example, the family planning program that I just talked about, that could not have taken place through just a grassroots movement. Mind you, there were tens of thousands of women who volunteered to be part of this program, but it involved a huge investment by the state to make contraceptive free and available, to have these mobile devices that I just talked about. So women, I think, should be smart, and wherever they can see something that can help their cause, they should help it. But at the same time, they should know that not every woman is a feminist. Every woman who goes there, and that's why I was giving this example of Islamist women who really are carving out an independent and often powerful identity for themselves, but at the expense of other women. So it's a question of what is this right? So if somebody goes up there and says widows should be given pension, we need to have more daycares, I really don't care who says it. Whoever says it, great. And if the government is going to listen to them, and I wish the government in the United States listened to people like that. So you have no idea what horrible shape we are in the United States. It's a catastrophe, an absolute catastrophe. Daycare is horribly expensive. Universities have become impossible to go to. I mean, you guys really are lucky. I'm so envious. So I wish we had people in the government in the United States who could help us out, because certainly the grassroots movement has always been very, very strong in the United States, but you can only do so much through grassroots.
Thank you.
We have time for another question if there is one. I see someone coming down.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very informing. As we've seen throughout your lecture, and anyone who's taken a class on Iranian studies, it seems that any progress that's been made for women's rights or for the emancipation of women has always kind of been impeded by the clergy and Islam that is so prevalent in Iran. So do you think that, as you just said yourself, that even within Islam, women still have to carve out their own separate identity, but by doing this, they're still participating in patriarchy and reducing other women's rights as a result. So do you think it's only until Iran goes through this secularization that the West has gone through and kind of sheds its the powerful power that Islam has in its politics and in gender rights, that it will finally have the same rights for women and men?
It's a hard question to answer. Remember, in the democratic revolutions in the West happened after religious reformation, right? So the battle for religious reformation, for a certain level of religious tolerance, at least within Christianity, had already been fought before measures were introduced or battles were fought for greater democracy. And then after that came like workers' rights, and then after that, way after that, came women's rights. And that's not the case in the Middle East. In the Middle East, women are fighting for their rights, but at the same time, they're, in a sense, fighting for religious reform, they're fighting for democracy, they're often fighting for trade unions, and that's why their struggle is so very difficult. To me, there's no really big difference between Islam and Judaism in one sense, in that they're they're very similar, if you study them, and Islam has been quite influenced by Judaism in terms of being a religion that's based on jurisprudence. And there's no reason that it can't be reformed in the way that Judaism has reformed itself. I'm giving an example of Judaism rather than Christianity because there are obvious differences. But in the same way that Judaism has gone through reform and conservative and so forth, and parts of it remain orthodox, the same thing can and is happening in Islam. And that's what we're seeing in Islam happening, certainly in Iran. This movement started in the early 1990s. The main argument of the theologians has been that there ought to be modern interpretations and new interpretations of the Quran, that what should not be bound by the text of the Quran, that it's really the spirit that matters, right? And I think that's the kind of argument that, otherwise if you follow Deuteronomy, I mean, you're supposed to stone adulterers and you're supposed to sell your daughter into slavery, right, according to the Jewish Bible, and yet we don't practice those things. So given the fact that people are Muslim, that people will remain Muslim, I think what's happening should be welcomed by those who are more secular and by non-Muslims, certainly, in that it provides all forms of being of Muslim. I mean, that's what we want. We want a plurality of Islam in which different people would find a niche for themselves. And yet at the same time, obviously, there has to be a separation on religion and state so that you would be able to establish laws that protect the rights of respects the majority, but protects the rights of the minority at the same time.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.